The alien spectators erupted into guttural cheers as the battered boy was shoved into the arena. He stumbled, barely conscious, his tattered robe streaked with dirt and blood. The alien executioners stood at the pit's edge, their four-clawed hands gripping spears humming with electromagnetic energy. The largest among them, an imposing figure with scales that shimmered like polished obsidian, raised a spiked arm and bellowed in its native tongue. Though the words were foreign to the boy, the mocking tone was unmistakable. He was nothing more than a sacrifice. Above the pit, the domed ceiling of the Colosseum reflected the vast expanse of the cosmos, a mesmerizing swirl of blues and purples, as if the very stars bore witness to the savagery below. The audience, a diverse mix of interstellar species, watched with eager anticipation. Some sipped luminescent drinks, their expressions ranging from amused disdain to an insatiable hunger for violence. In the pit's center lay a dragon, its silver-white scales glinting under the glow of the artificial sun overhead. The creature's immense form was nearly beyond comprehension. Its tail alone could have flattened a settlement. Slowly, its amber eyes slid open, locking onto the boy. Its nostrils flared as it inhaled, tasting his scent. A slow exhale sent ripples of heat through the air. The crowd's roar intensified, but the boy did not move. He lay motionless, his bandaged head resting against the dirt, his breath shallow. This was meant to be his end. The events that had led to this moment had begun 6 months prior, when the Galactic Union's exploration fleet first encountered the Varrock species. Officially, it was a diplomatic mission, an opportunity to establish relations in an uncharted sector of the galaxy. But the Varrock had no interest in peace. Their culture, built on conquest and ritualized displays of dominance, saw the Union's negotiations as weakness. The delegation was seized, their leader, Admiral Solus, imprisoned, and several officers publicly executed. Among the captives was Lieutenant Kyle Ryan, a 12-year-old human prodigy, a tactical genius who had graduated from the Union's Naval Academy, while most his age were still mastering arithmetic. He had been assigned to the mission as an advisor, an anomaly even among the Union's diverse ranks. His brilliant mind had already saved countless lives in the ongoing conflicts against the remnants of the Dominion. But to the Varrock, he was an opportunity for spectacle. The child soldier, as they mockingly called him, was paraded through their capital, Zoran Prime, his injuries worsening with each passing day as the Varrock jeered and pelted him with debris. Still, he did not cry out or plead. His pale face remained set in grim determination. Now, in the pit, the dragon's gaze lingered on him. It tilted its massive head, golden horns catching the light. But to the crowd's astonishment, the beast did not attack. It did not roar or lunge. Instead, it lowered its snout, breathing deeply near the boy's still form. For a moment, the arena fell silent, as if the galaxy itself held its breath. The boy stirred. His left hand twitched in the dust before he weakly lifted his head. Through blurred vision, he saw the dragon's immense face inches from his own. Intelligent, ancient eyes met his. He felt no malice in its stare, only curiosity. Summoning what little strength remained, Kale whispered, "Are you going to kill me too?" The dragon did not respond, not in any way the Varrock could perceive, but Kale felt something, an awareness, a presence in his mind. The creature was speaking without words, its thoughts brushing against his own. He understood, and in that moment, he realized what the Varrock had failed to see. This was no mindless beast. It was sentient, a being as sharp as any strategist he had ever faced. Outside the pit, Varrock commanders exchanged uneasy glances. This was not how the ritual sacrifice was meant to unfold. The dragon should have incinerated its offering within seconds. Yet here it stood, silent, watchful. The largest of the executioners barked an order. 2 guards stepped forward, their spears raised. But before they could step into the pit, the dragon moved. Its tail lashed out with the force of a meteor strike, sending a shockwave through the arena. The guards were thrown backward, their bodies slamming into the pit walls. Dust and debris filled the air, and the crowd erupted into chaos. The dragon unfurled its wings, their translucent membranes catching the light, and let out a deafening roar, not of rage, but defiance. Kale pushed himself upright, his breath ragged. The dragon's thoughts pressed into his own once more. It was not a language, yet he understood. You are not prey. The Varrock had underestimated what would come next. The dragon, long enslaved to their rituals, had been waiting for this moment. For centuries, it had endured these sacrifices, its intelligence ignored, its power exploited. But the boy's presence, a fragile human, unafraid despite his injuries, awakened something buried deep inside it. Kyle felt the dragon's consciousness expand. Images flooded his mind. A world lost to cosmic destruction, a species hunted to the brink of extinction, and a seething hatred for its captors. With his sharp tactical mind, Kale recognized the opportunity. Barely audible, he whispered, "We can fight back. Together." The dragon did not reply with words. It answered with action. With a single thunderous beat of its wings, it rose into the air, carrying Kale in its clawed grasp. The pit walls collapsed beneath them, sending the nearest Varrock scrambling for cover. From its vantage point, the dragon unleashed a torrent of fire. Not indiscriminate destruction, but precision strikes. It targeted the energy pylons powering the arena's containment field, plunging the entire structure into chaos. Above, Varrock warships stirred, engines igniting. But Kale's mind was already racing. Through the link he shared with the dragon, he saw the capital's defenses, its weaknesses. His voice, hoarse but resolute, rang through their bond. The shield generators, in the southern quadrant. Destroy them, and their fleet is exposed. The dragon dived. It moved with impossible precision for a creature of its size. Below, the city fell into panic as they tore through the sky. Varrock fighters pursued, but the dragon's agility outmatched them. Kale clung tightly to its spines, his heart pounding. He shouted coordinates, strategies. The shield generators were housed in a fortified complex, surrounded by anti-aircraft turrets. But Kale noticed a flaw, a blind spot in their defensive grid. "There!" he commanded. The dragon unleashed a focused blast of plasma breath. The generators detonated in a cascade of blue fire. The city's protective dome flickered, then collapsed entirely. Aboard the orbiting Union flagship Vanguard, Admiral Solus watched in stunned silence as the Varrock defenses crumbled. His ship's sensors locked onto an impossible sight. A dragon, with a rider. "Is that Lieutenant Ryan?" an officer asked, disbelief in his voice. Solus didn't answer immediately. He stared at the screen, then gave a single order. "Signal all ships. The Varrock just made a fatal mistake. Launch the counter-offensive." As Union forces surged forward, weapons blazing, the battle for survival had begun. And at its heart, a boy and a dragon, fighting as one. She approached the control console, her fingers trembling as she worked. The reactor's containment protocols were complex, but Kale's mind was sharper. He bypassed layer after layer of encryption, his determination unwavering. The dragon's voice, or rather, its presence, brushed against his thoughts. "They are coming." "I know," he murmured, barely audible. "Just a little longer." The first squad of Varrock commandos stormed into the reactor chamber, weapons raised. Kyle didn't look up. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. One of the soldiers hesitated, his grip on his rifle faltering. "He's just a boy," he muttered in their guttural tongue. "He's a threat," barked another, raising his weapon. Before either could act, the dragon arrived. It smashed through the chamber's secondary entrance, its roar shaking the walls. The soldiers scattered, their formation disintegrating under the sheer force of its arrival. Plasma bolts ricocheted harmlessly off its scales as it advanced, claws slashing through conduits to cut off reinforcements. Kale seized the moment, his fingers flying across the console. He found what he needed, an override command to destabilize the reactor. It was a gamble, one that could either disable the ship or obliterate it entirely. "This is it," he whispered, entering the final sequence. The dragon's presence filled his mind again, this time tinged with concern. "You won't make it out in time." Kale hesitated, his hands hovering over the controls. "I know," he admitted, his voice cracking. But he steeled himself. If we don't do this, they'll keep coming. This ship is the core of their fleet. We have to stop it here. The dragon's gaze bore into him, its amber eyes reflecting centuries of pain and loss. For a moment, neither moved. Then the dragon made its decision. It lowered its head, coiling its vast body around him protectively. Its consciousness enveloped his own, and for the first time, Kale fully understood the depth of their bond. This wasn't just protection. It was a choice. The dragon was choosing him. Choosing humanity. Alarms blared, a cacophony of warning signals echoing through the ship. Kyle felt the heat rising, the energy building toward catastrophic levels. He closed his eyes, bracing for the end. But the dragon wasn't finished. With a mighty roar, it unfurled its wings and leapt toward the reactor core. Its claws pierced the pulsing sphere of energy. The chamber was engulfed in blinding light, and Kyle felt himself being lifted, cradled by the dragon's immense strength. He didn't understand how it was containing the explosion, but he trusted it completely. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was the reactor collapsing in on itself, the dragon's form glowing with an otherworldly brilliance. The ship shuddered violently, its structure failing. And then, silence. When Kale woke, he was aboard the Vanguard. The sterile hum of medical equipment filled the room, an IV tugging at his arm. Commodore Solis stood at his bedside, his expression unreadable. "You're lucky to be alive," he said gruffly. Kale swallowed, his throat dry. "The dragon?" Solis hesitated. "We don't know what happened to it. The ship was destroyed, but we detected an energy signature leaving the debris field. It could still be out there." Kale closed his eyes, his heart aching with a mix of hope and loss. He didn't know if he'd ever see the dragon again. But one thing was certain. Their bond had changed the course of the war, and it wasn't over yet. The sterile hum of the Vanguard's infirmary was a poor substitute for silence. Kyle lay motionless, his body aching with the dull throb of healing wounds. But it wasn't the physical pain that consumed his thoughts. It was the absence. He had felt the dragon's mind slip away the moment the reactor collapsed, and no amount of Commodore Solis's cautious optimism could fill the void it left behind. He stared at the ceiling, its blank panels as empty as his future. For the first time since the Varrock had paraded him through their capital, he felt truly powerless. Their bond had been more than an alliance. It had been a merging of purpose, an understanding that transcended words. Now, it was gone. And with it, the fragile confidence he had always relied on. The infirmary door slid open, jolting him from his thoughts. Solis entered, his presence commanding even in the dim light. He carried a datapad, his expression unreadable. "You look terrible," he said, his tone a mixture of gruff concern and an attempt at humor. "I feel worse," Kyle muttered. "What's the news?" Solis sat beside his cot, setting the datapad down. "The good news is the Varrock flagship is gone. Without it, their fleet is in disarray. They've retreated to the outer systems, licking their wounds." "And the bad news?" Kale asked, already knowing there was more. Solis exhaled. "They're not finished. Intelligence suggests they have a fallback plan. We intercepted fragments of their communications. They're regrouping around something they call the Keystone." Kale frowned. The word was unfamiliar. "What is it?" Solis leaned back, his jaw tightening. "We don't know. But whatever it is, they're treating it like their last resort. High Command wants us to investigate." Kale sat up, wincing. "You're taking me with you." "Absolutely not," Solis said firmly. "You've done enough. You need rest." Kale's eyes narrowed. "Rest won't stop the Varrock from coming back stronger. If this keystone is important to them, we need to know why. And you know, I'm the best chance you have of figuring it out." Solis sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. He didn't argue. They both knew Kale was right. The Vanguard jumped to hyperspace, its engines humming with the rhythmic pulse of FTL travel. Kale, now cleared from the infirmary, spent the journey in the tactical briefing room, poring over intercepted Varrock data with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The fragments of information painted a cryptic picture. The Keystone wasn't a weapon. Nor was it a ship. It was something ancient, predating even Varrock recorded history. The transmissions referenced the Nexus, the Gate, and most troublingly, the Harbinger. A chill ran down Cale's spine. The Keystone wasn't just a strategic asset. It was a gamble. The Varrock were desperate enough to awaken something they didn't fully understand, and that made it dangerous. The Vanguard emerged from hyperspace into a graveyard of celestial debris. Shattered moons drifted around a dying star, their surfaces scarred by ancient cataclysms. Charming place, Kyle muttered, studying the sensor readings. Varrock ships detected, the tactical officer reported. 3 vessels in low orbit around the 5th moon. Solus nodded. Battle stations. Prepare for engagement. Kyle's gaze lingered on the tactical display. The Varrock ships weren't positioned for defense. They were clustered around a single point, guarding something. "What's on that moon?" he asked. The science officer checked her console. "Scans show a subterranean structure. It's massive. Artificial. Definitely not Varrock in origin." Cale's pulse quickened. "That's it. That's the Keystone." The battle was swift and brutal. The Vanguard outmatched the Varrock ships, but the enemy fought with desperation. One vessel broke formation, diving toward the moon's surface. "They're going to ground," Solus observed. "They don't want us getting to the Keystone." Cale's jaw tightened. "Then we go after them." Solus hesitated, then gave the order. "Prepare a ground team." Kyle smirked. "Try and stop me." As their dropships descended toward the ancient structure, Kyle felt it. An unmistakable pull. And deep beneath the surface, something was waking. An ancient presence brushed against his mind. But this was nothing like the dragon. This was cold, alien, and utterly devoid of empathy. The Varrock leader roared in panic. "You have doomed us all!" Cale's mind raced. This was the Keystone's true nature. It wasn't just a gateway to knowledge or power. It was something far worse. Something that even the Varrock, for all their brutality, had been desperately trying to keep sealed away. He turned to the team. "We need to leave, now." But it was too late. The sphere cracked, and a blinding light engulfed the chamber. For a moment, Kyle thought he was dead. But when the light faded, he was still standing. Only everything had changed. The walls shimmered with an otherworldly glow, and the air felt thinner, sharper. And then he saw it. A figure emerged from the light, humanoid in shape, impossibly tall, its radiant form overwhelming. It spoke, not with words, but with thoughts that echoed through the chamber. "I am the Harbinger. You have freed me." Cale's knees buckled, his worldview shattering like glass. This wasn't just a battle for survival. This was the beginning of something far worse. The Harbinger's luminous form towered over them, its presence distorting reality itself. Cale couldn't look directly at it. Its very existence pressed against his mind like an unbearable weight. The Varrock leader, his earlier confidence a distant memory, dropped to his knees, muttering what sounded like prayers. "You have freed me," the Harbinger repeated. Its voice wasn't a sound, but a cascade of overwhelming impressions, filling Cale's thoughts like an unstoppable tide. He braced himself against the pedestal as his vision swam. The alien intelligence radiated cold indifference, as though its millennia of imprisonment had stripped away all concept of mortal existence. "What do you want?" he forced himself to ask, his voice trembling but steady. The Harbinger's attention shifted toward him. In its mind, Cale saw flashes. Civilizations long dead. Entire star systems wiped clean of life. It was destruction incarnate, a force that saw existence itself as nothing more than a fleeting inconvenience. "I was bound to prevent my purpose," it said. "But now I will fulfill it." It gestured vaguely toward the Varrock leader. "Your kind. Their kind. It makes no difference. I will cleanse the stars." Cale's breath caught. This wasn't a war. It was extinction. And he had been the one to unleash it. His mind raced. He wasn't a soldier, not really. He was a tactician, and tacticians didn't win with brute strength. They found the flaw, the opening, the hidden lever that collapsed everything. His eyes darted to the Varrock leader, to the pedestal, to the shattered remains of the sphere. And then it hit him. The keystone wasn't just a prison. It was a failsafe. The Varrock hadn't been trying to harness its power. They had been trying to contain it. The inscriptions on the walls weren't decorative. They were instructions, containment protocols, written in glyphs so ancient that even the Varrock barely understood them. The Harbinger's radiance pulsed, growing brighter as its form stabilized in their reality. The chamber quaked, cracks splintering across the walls. The very structure groaned under the strain of its presence. "You said you wanted to contain it!" Kale shouted at the Varrock leader. "How? What's the protocol?" The leader snapped out of his stupor, his eyes narrowing in sudden realization. "The sphere," he rasped. "It must be restored." Kale's heart sank. The sphere was broken, its shards scattered across the chamber. "It's destroyed," he said. "There's no restoring it now." The Varrock shook his head. The keystone was designed to be rebuilt in crisis, but it requires an anchor, a consciousness to bind it. Kale froze. He understood immediately. The keystone's energy had always been stabilized by a sentient mind, one strong enough to interface with its alien systems. The Harbinger had been imprisoned because someone, had willingly become its jailer. And now that jailer was gone. His thoughts turned to the dragon. Its sacrifice had saved him, but it had also left the keystone unanchored. Without it, the prison had failed. The Harbinger's release hadn't been a mistake. It had been inevitable. The Harbinger's form grew larger, its light stretching to consume the chamber. "Your time is over," it declared, its voice reverberating through reality itself. "I will begin with you." Kale's mind reeled. There had to be another way. He looked at the broken shards of the sphere, then at the glyphs. The Varrock's words echoed in his mind. "It requires an anchor." He didn't hesitate. "Cover me!" he shouted to the ground team. The soldiers hesitated, just for a second, before opening fire. Energy bolts blazed through the air, trying to hold the Harbinger at bay. But the entity didn't even flinch. The shots passed through it harmlessly, as if it existed on a plane just out of reach. Kale scrambled toward the shattered sphere, his hands shaking as he gathered the fragments. They hummed with residual energy, making his fingers tingle. He had no idea if this would work. He didn't even fully understand what he was doing. But there was no other choice. Behind him, the Harbinger turned its attention to the soldiers. A single wave of its hand sent an unseen force slamming into them, hurling their bodies across the chamber. Kale winced, but he didn't stop. "Bind it!" the Varrock leader shouted. "You must bind it before it fully manifests." Kale gritted his teeth, pressing the final shard into place. The sphere flickered, unstable, incomplete. He placed his hands on its surface, feeling the hum of its energy vibrate through his entire being. The Harbinger loomed over him. "You cannot contain me," it said. "I am infinite. You are nothing." Kale ignored it. He closed his eyes. The keystone was searching for an anchor, for a mind strong enough to hold the Harbinger at bay. But it wasn't automatic. It required a choice, a willing mind to take on the burden. His thoughts flickered back to the dragon, its final moments. The way it had shielded him from the reactor's explosion. It had made its choice. Now, it was his turn. The keystone's energy surged, pulling at his mind, his memories, his sense of self. He clung to them, but the pull was relentless. He saw flashes of his life, the academy, his family, the mission that had brought him here. And then he saw the dragon. Its golden eyes watched him with quiet understanding. "I can't do this," he whispered. "I'm not strong enough." But then he understood. It wasn't about strength. The dragon hadn't been chosen because it was the strongest. It had been chosen because it was willing. The Harbinger's light dimmed, its form wavering. It could feel the keystone's power taking hold. "You will fail," it said, a note of fear creeping into its voice. Kale opened his eyes. He met its gaze. Not this time. With a final surge, the keystone activated. The chamber was bathed in blinding light as the Harbinger's form was drawn into the sphere, its screams echoing through the void. Kyle felt himself slipping away, his mind fusing with the keystone. He knew he wouldn't come back. The anchor couldn't leave the prison. It was a one-way trip, but he didn't regret it. As the light faded, the chamber fell silent. The Varrock leader stood in awe. The ground team watched, grief and shock in their eyes. A voice crackled over the comms. "What's happening down there? Ryan, report." The Varrock leader picked up Kale's discarded comm unit. His voice was heavy with reverence. "The human is gone. He has bound the keystone." Above, the stars turned. And far within the void, Kale smiled.